On the Buzz Meter this Sunday, a media earthquake over a Washington Post report that Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore sexually molested a 14-year-old girl decades ago. And he hits back by saying this garbage is the very definition of fake news.
Even just the allegation itself, it's not just one person, it's multiple people. So the whole cloud, the whole stench around this guy, I don't see how he can represent Alabama in the U.S. Senate.
Roy Moore, who has lived his entire public life as the holiest man in American politics, stands accused tonight of a felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. And he is still a candidate to serve time in the United States Senate.
A 32-year-old man pursuing a 14-year-old girl is disgusting. That is something we should all agree on. This should transcend politics.
Well, look, the timing of these allegations 1 month before the election makes them highly suspect. I mean, let me get this straight. These acts allegedly took place in 1979, and her first disclosure is 38 years later.
The depths and depravity of conservative media outlets that defend someone like Roy Moore, who is now known to be a pedophile, unless you don't believe the women.
With President Trump, Mitch McConnell, and other Republicans saying Moore should quit the race if the allegations are true, how strong is the Washington Post story, which quotes 4 women on the record as saying the former judge pursued them as teenagers? The president taking media flack for tweeting about wanting to be Kim Jong-un's friend and saying he believes Vladimir Putin is sincere in denying any Russian hacking. Are these the gaffes being portrayed by the press? Louis C.K. apologizes for sexual misconduct after the New York Times reports graphic accusations from several women.
All right, I get it. It sucks going out with me.
And the story leads to the cancellation of his new movie and several TV deals. Plus, a stunning account of how Harvey Weinstein used private detectives to try to intimidate his accusers and the journalists who were on his trail. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. The Washington Post story on Alabama Republican Roy Moore is based on a series of on-the-record interviews with Lee Kaufman, who says she was 14 when Moore, a 32-year-old prosecutor, befriended her and then sexually accosted her. Here's a Post reporter's description of what happened.
So the first time there was kissing, and then the second time he took off her clothes, he took off his own clothes.
I have not been guilty of sexual misconduct with anyone. These allegations came only 4.5 weeks before the general election on December 12th. Why now?
3 other women told the Post on the record that Moore pursued relationships with them when they were between 16 and 18, but that nothing was involved more than kissing. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. Juan Williams, co-host of The Five. And Erin McPike, senior advisor to Media Group of America, owner of Independent Journal Review. Molly, let's take a look at this Washington Post story. 4 women who don't know each other, who didn't put this out. The reporters came to them. And Lee Kaufman, the woman who says she was 14 at the time, says she voted for Donald Trump. Does this sound like an orchestrated campaign against Moore?
I think this is, a very important and explosive story. The problem for discussing the quality of this news is that this is in a media environment where many other explosive stories about sexual assault that are well-sourced have fallen apart. It was less than 3 years ago when Sabrina R. Erdely wrote the cover story for Rolling Stone about a gang rape at UVA. Media praised her for this story. They praised the courage of everybody involved, and they sort of reflexively accepted this story, and it turned out that it was completely misreported. Yep. The fraternity that was maligned won $1.65 million. A dean who was maligned won $3 million. Well, at least. It's not just it's not that, because there's a different standard on that. What I'm saying is people are used to stories about sexual assault not necessarily coming to be as credible as they are first presented. The UVA, or the Duke lacrosse team, was also accused of a gang rape. That story fell apart. The people who were accused were actually declared innocent. So there is a media environment where people are not necessarily going to accept whatever they hear from a media outlet just because they're told it's well-sourced.
Okay, but now also Lee Kaufman, again, this is the woman who says she was 14 at the time. The Washington Post talked to 2 friends. She told at the time she was dating an older man, talked to her mom, who was told a decade later. And in an interview on the radio with Sean Hannity, Roy Moore went through all this, said it was politically motivated and so forth. And then he said this.
Do you remember dating girls that young at that time?
Not generally, no. If I did, I'm not going to dispute anything.
That was not exactly a hard denial, Lon.
No, and, so much of what he had to say to Sean Hannity was emphatic in saying that he didn't even know Korfman. But then he said that. And I think that what you just played will introduce doubt into the listener or viewer's mind as to what Roy Moore is exactly disputing. Because it's not okay to have been going out with teenage girls.
And then there was this tweet from Roy Moore, who's, of course, the Senate election battles next month. Put this up on the screen. The Obama-Clinton machine's liberal media lapdogs just launched the most vicious and nasty round of attacks against me I've ever faced. What does this have to do with Obama and Hillary?
Absolutely nothing. And here's the thing. To your earlier point about the stories that broke down, that was 3 years ago, and a lot has happened since then. And I think the important thing with this story is that you had all 4 of these women on the record. Not only that, the Post interviewed Lee Korfman 6 times. 6 times they got her on the record to check consistency, talk to her mother, they talked to friends of the other women who were involved, because they wanted the story to be airtight and control for all of these complaints. And I think they did a great job of that, because that story is airtight.
Now, I take your point, Molly, that not every allegation is true, and you pointed to some past instances, but a few conservative media people are defending Roy Moore, but mostly not. National Review said he should quit the race.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is a well-timed hit, and it's a very difficult thing for people to talk about. I mean, stories about sexual assault are always very difficult to report, and they're very difficult to respond to. And it doesn't mean that when you take them seriously that you just reflexively accept claims or reflexively accept denials. There's been quite a bit of fervor about this story, not as much maybe calm thought about it, but it's just a very difficult story, and these are very serious allegations. I think it's important.
Molly, part of this is in the political context. The journalistic stories you cite, yes, they were screwed up, but in the political context, what people are worried about here in Washington is the loss of a Republican seat in the U.S. Senate to Doug Jones, the Democrat, and right now that race is very tight. And the idea would be, oh, the Democrats or some political apparatus by these mean Democrats set this up to defeat Roy Moore. The problem is that people are now saying, well, exactly how is Ms. Korfman a part of that machine? How is, and no one has an answer. What is in her interest to come out and expose herself to the kind of criticism, the allegations that she's just part of the Democrats at this point? She's a Trump voter.
Here's part of the criticism. So interestingly, the Moore campaign gave this story in advance to Breitbart, the conservative media site, giving the list of Post questions. Breitbart was able to scoop the Post by a little bit, leading off with the judge's denials. But then you had Steve Bannon, the chairman of Breitbart, obviously the former Trump White House advisor, saying this and hearkening back to the fact that it was the Washington Post that in the campaign broke the Access Hollywood tape about Donald Trump. Take a look.
Is it just a coincidence that the Bezos, Amazon, Washington Post did the Billy Bush hit, and they did the hit on Judge Moore? Yeah, just a complete random thing in the universe, right?
Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. What do you make of that line of criticism that because the Post had broken the story about candidate Trump, that this story should be suspect?
It's all about ginning up the base. And the Moore campaign obviously went to Breitbart before the Post broke the story. I have seen campaigns try to get ahead of stories before, but not like that, to actually reveal everything that is in the story that is going to be coming out. That seemed to me a bridge far that I've never seen crossed before.
Let's talk about selective outrage in the media, because you have, in pundits and politicians, you have liberals now, of course, denouncing Roy Moore. He was a controversial figure before because of comments on homosexuality, and he had been removed from the state Supreme Court in Alabama. And then you have Democrats, Democrats who are, when they're accused of sexual misconduct, then there's hand-wringing, well, we don't know if these allegations are true. So it seems to a lot of people that the reaction can be partisan depending on who is the target of these accusations.
It doesn't just seem that way. It is that way. I just want to first off remind people that George Stephanopoulos pulled the original Bannon trick here, or pulled the original trick of going to Breitbart when Washington Free Beacon had the story about him giving $75,000 to Hillary Clinton. They asked him for comment. He ran to Politico instead. It's a totally mean move, but it's one of these things that we see. Right. But it is true that this is in such a bigger context. People are pretending that this is just a story story about, a very genuine story about this person. The Washington Post has positioned itself as part of the resistance. They have decided to take a very hostile oppositional stance toward the president, and that means the president's agenda, the Republican Party in general. And so people are skeptical about the timing. They're skeptical about the story itself, and it's actually somewhat unfair because the story should stand or fall on its own merits. But it's part of a larger context where the Post has been so oppositional.
Can I jump in for a second? So to your question, Tamala, just a minute ago, that it is based on partisanship, I take issue with that, and here's why. On Friday in Colorado's NPR station, as well as the Denver Post, broke a story about a state representative who is a Democrat named Steve Lepsek, who another Democratic state representative by the name of Faith Winter accused of aggressively sexually harassing her at the end of last year. In the same story breaking it, the Democratic Speaker of the House called for that representative's resignation, and she said, and I quote, "I believe there should be extremely high standards of conduct for the legislature." If you're calling for the resignation of a member of your own party in the story breaking
there are certainly exceptions where people take on. Mitch McConnell didn't wait very long before going after Judge Moore. And by the way, when it was Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, a lot of liberal pundits and politicians made excuses for the president. But just to finish on the Washington Post, so yes, the editorial page, which is run by a separate editor, has called Roy Moore unfit, clearly a liberal editorial page. I understand people take issue with the Post reporting, but this doesn't necessarily make the story untrue. You have to look at the evidence, the interviews with the four women. Do they have partisan motivations? Again, Lee Corcoran voted for Donald Trump and George W. Bush.
That was my point. And the second point to make here is at some point, given Roy Moore's evangelical projection that he is a man of God and his stand on the Ten Commandments, at some point I think it's very difficult for people. We're in the Bible Belt in Alabama. I think it's really on them to make a decision here. And when it comes to questioning the Post politically, part of the resistance, not a resistance, I don't know. But I'll tell you this. If you are looking at that story in and of itself, in terms of the sourcing and in terms of people on the record, as a reporter, I've been a reporter for a long time. That story's pretty tight.
Right, but of course, a lot of people are either not going to believe the media or going to say, hey, this was 38 years ago. Or before we go to break, Democratic Mayor Bill de Blasio reelected to a second term in New York. Look at the tabloid covers. Tabloids are not fans of Mayor de Blasio. And they show it in their headlines. All right, when we come back, the media pouncing on the president over controversial comments on Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin. We'll look at his Twitter diplomacy. And later, Dana Perino on the press corps doing battle with Sarah Huckabee Sanders. President Trump had been getting modest but respectful coverage of his trip to Japan, South Korea, China, and Vietnam. That is until this weekend. He went on a tweet storm that included this missive on North Korea's leader. Why would Kim Jong-un insult me by calling me old when I would never call him short and fat? Oh, well, I try so hard to be his friend, and maybe someday that will happen. Molly Hemingway, this is an unusual form of presidential diplomacy, but the press is ripping this as somewhere between undisciplined and nutty.
You know, it's funny because Twitter just doubled its character count, and I thought it was a horrible idea. But seeing what you can do with twice the Twitter characters, it really does make the case for doubling it. But it's a perfect example of how everyone seems to hear Donald Trump differently depending on their perspective. And you either think that when he says something like this, it's horrific and awful and about to lead us into World War III, or you think it's really funny. And I think the media issue is that so many people in the media reside only in one camp. They seem to only hear it as a threat and as a danger, and they don't really hear it as so many other people, not just in the country, but the world, hear it.
Whether it was wise or not, Juan, the press is still not accustomed to the fact that President Trump doesn't speak in carefully scrubbed diplomatic phrases, especially on the Twitter.
No, but I mean, this goes beyond that. I mean, the question is, you know, these are now official documents, his Twitter account. It's not just, oh, something just got thrown
it's
off.
important.
So it's real. And it comes from the commander-in-chief, and it comes from the leader of the free world. So, yes, it's funny. It's like schoolyard. If you and I, Howie, are staying in the schoolyard, we're joking with fine.
Yeah.
But when I'm leader of the free world and I start talking in those terms, I think it concerns people. Does he have control? And then people say, well, that's partisan. It's not partisan. It's just a worry.
What's also part of this controversy is what the president had to say or didn't have to say about Vladimir Putin, who he met with informally a couple of times at the Asia-Pacific Conference. So let me set this up. The president talked to reporters on a plane trip in Vietnam. And he said, I will just read it. He said, Trump talking about Putin. He said he absolutely did not meddle in our election. He did not do what they are saying he did. I really believe that when he tells me that, he means it. So there's a lot of shock and horror about this. What was the president saying? He then tried in an appearance with reporters to walk it back just a little bit. Look.
What I said there is that I believe he believes that, and that's very important for somebody to believe. I believe that he feels that he and Russia did not meddle in the election. As to whether I believe it or not, I'm with our agencies.
Agency, of course. So is this a misstep, a miscommunication, something in between in terms of the way the press is playing
it? It's not a miscommunication. He obviously walked it back. There's a lot of believing in there, so it's hard to believe what to believe because there was so much believing. But I do want to go back to the tweets for just a second because John Kelly was asked about this by reporters on the trip, and he basically said, I tell my staff not to worry about the tweets. I'm not really going to take any questions on the tweets. And that is something that a number of administration staff have done. When Sean Spicer was press secretary, he always used to say at the podium, you know, the tweets speak for themselves. That is also what Sarah Sanders has said. So they obviously know the tweets are a problem, and they don't want to take questions on them.
The transcript does suggest, Molly, that Donald Trump believes Putin. If you look at the transcript, but people who've heard the audio, like Fox's John Roberts, say the inflection makes clear that that wasn't Trump's meeting. The White House, by the way, won't release the audio, so we can't hear it first.
They should release the audio.
Okay.
I don't really think that what Trump said made sense there, either the original comment or what he was saying in the walk back. But it's also true that you see media respond to things he says or tweets, and they overstate what he's saying. So it is better to kind of take a step back, look at this larger issue of the relationship with Russia, whether they've understood properly his posture toward Russia. He did not, I mean, it's very difficult at a time like that, his original statement or his walk.
Yeah, and that is the larger context one, because in another tweet, the president said only haters and fools would be opposed to a good relationship with Russia. And that's what he's been pursuing, and that's what a lot of the media folks find controversial.
Well, you see, the thing here is that we are, again, the context to the story is so important. We're in the midst of a probe as to the extent and dangers of interference in the American election by Russia. And so here's, he's just saying, I don't believe, and you think, so how's that possible, given what the intelligence agencies have reported, his own intelligence agencies, his own CIA director, and it fits in with what we were talking about earlier, Howie, which is this man has nuclear weapons.
Yes, most presidents do.
Yes.
Juan Williams, Aaron McPike, thanks very much. Molly, we'll see you later. Ahead, a bombshell report on Harvey Weinstein using private detectives to intimidate journalists investigating his conduct. But up next, new allegations that the Justice Department is trying to block AT&T from buying CNN. Will this impact that mega merger?
AT&T is buying Time Warner and thus CNN. A deal we will not approve in my administration because it's too much concentration of power in the hands of too few.
Several news outlets reported this week the Justice Department might be pressuring AT&T to sell off CNN in exchange for federal approval to buy the network's parent company, Time Warner. But is that true? Joining us now, Shannon Pettypiece, White House correspondent for Bloomberg News. So there's been conflicting reports here. This one in the New York Times front page headline: at heart of AT&T merger, another fight, Trump versus CNN. We all know the president considers CNN to not have high journalistic standards. What do you make of that?
So our reporting indicates very strongly that the Justice Department is putting pressure on AT&T to find a way to move forward with this deal without owning the Turner Broadcasting Network, which owns CNN and TNT and TBS and a few other channels. That the Justice Department wants AT&T to find a way to do this deal while either divesting Turner or creating some sort of joint venture or some way this deal can go forward without Turner and CNN in the package.
White House, by the way, says President had no contact with the Justice Department on this issue. Now, another version denied by the CEO of AT&T is that the company offered to sell CNN. But then there's also a version that says the Justice Department did what you said, sell off Turner Broadcasting, including CNN, or sell off DirecTV. And my question is, aren't these sort of the normal kinds of concerns that come up in antitrust negotiations with big mergers, as opposed to being a plot to try to get CNN to be sold?
Well, what's unusual about this and what has people questioning this deal is typically antitrust regulators get involved when it's two competitors, direct competitors, buying each other, and the result of that merger could create a monopoly. So Ford buying GM, ABC buying NBC, those type of deals. In this case, AT&T and Time Warner aren't direct competitors. This is what they call a vertical merger. And the concern, as far as we can decipher from the Justice Department, is that if AT&T owned the Turner content of CNN and TBS and all those other channels, they would be able to say to consumers, hey, we're not going to let you, if any other providers want to carry CNN, they can't. You have to get AT&T DirecTV if you want to have CNN.
Well, my point is you can argue either way, but that's a classic antitrust concern. It's not necessarily a political attempt to silence CNN.
It's a little bit different in this case because they're not real direct competitors in this case. So,
Let me move you to the trip to China, where President Trump and President Xi walked off without taking reporters' questions. Take a brief look at that.
President Trump, questions? Do you take questions, Mr. President?
So Sarah Huckabee Sanders told reporters it was she who did not want to have a Q&A with reporters. Since previous presidents, although there's an exception, Barack Obama on his first trip to China, insisted to the Chinese that we're going to take questions. What kind of signal does that send?
Well, the Obama administration officials were on the record talking about this very issue and what they learned from it. They had a very similar situation, as you suggested, where they did not take questions from the press in the first press conference with the Chinese. They learned from that. They felt that did not send a signal and really went to the mat on that going forward. So I'm sure this will not be the last time President Trump is in China, so we'll see what they do next time. But it sounds like it's one of those common mistakes an administration can make early on when they don't know that that there is a way to pressure the Chinese into.
Yeah, but then the question is, how much do you want to pressure the Chinese when you need the Chinese help on North Korea or whatever?
Right. Is that what you want to go to the mat on? Is that where you want to fire one of your bullets? Yes.
Shannon Pennypiece, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us this Sunday. Ahead, new testimony appears to knock down the most salacious part of that unverified Trump dossier. That's later. But first, Louis C.K. apologizes after a New York Times story on his sexual misconduct cost the comedian his new movie.
You're with Leslie Goodwin?
Isn't that weird?
No, it's not that weird. He likes young girls.
Yes, he does.
China.
Everybody's a pervert. I'm a pervert. We're all perverts. Who cares?
The Times quoted 5 women, 4 of them on the record, as saying the comedian masturbated in front of them or during a phone call or asked to do so. Now, in an apology, Louis C.K. said he'd asked permission to expose himself, but took advantage of his fame, quote, which disabled them from sharing their story and brought hardship to them when they tried because people didn't want to hear it. There is nothing about this that I forgive myself for. I've brought pain to my family, my friends, my children, and their mother. HBO, Netflix, and FX networks owned by Fox's parent company canceled projects with Louis, with FX saying he'll no longer receive any revenue from 4 joint productions. Joining us now from Los Angeles, Matt Bellany, editor of The Hollywood Reporter. And Matt, The Hollywood Reporter actually broke the news of Louis C.K.'s movie premiere being canceled just before the New York Times posted that story with the allegations from the women. And then, as I said, Louis issuing this full-throated apology. Did he have much choice?
No, I mean, this is an issue that is roiling the entertainment industry, and we're seeing people acting very quickly to respond to these allegations. FX the next day canceled not just the Louis C.K. program, but all of the programs that he has an involvement with, he will be taken off of. So that's a pretty swift move for a network that has been in the Louis C.K. business for a decade now, very intertwined with him.
Right. It shows you the swiftness of the actions in this environment. Now, Louis had faced sexual harassment allegations for years, rumors, I guess I should say, but it took the New York Times, which also broke the Harvey Weinstein story, to get these women on the record, which I think is the key to any of these stories.
Absolutely, and this is the Louis C.K. thing is something that had been rumored in comedy circles for years. I mean, I had even heard the rumors. You know, no one had said so publicly, but there had been allusions to this, and obviously his comedy touches on this kind of humor and the sex talk and such. So people wondered, but again, it's a case of women coming forward on the record to tell their stories. It's a very courageous thing that these women did, and that's what broke the tide here.
Right. Now, Ronan Farrow has this extraordinarily well-documented piece in The New Yorker this week about Harvey Weinstein hiring these private detective agencies to get in touch with, intimidate, attempt to undermine some of the accusers of the movie mogul, but also journalists who are working on this story. Does that fit with your understanding of how Weinstein operated?
Absolutely. This is a remarkable story because it really shows how this kind of behavior was kept under wraps for decades. I mean, these are former Israeli Mossad agents who are being enlisted to target these women and journalists, and Harvey Weinstein was getting journalists to help him. You know, there's a part in there about the editor of the National Enquirer being enlisted to help Harvey Weinstein attack these potential accusers. They dug up dirt on various editors at different magazines. He would try to do book deals with people to take them out of play. I mean, this is a very sophisticated, in my opinion, sinister operation.
Sinister is a good word, but how could a movie mogul use these kind of tactics, paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to these private eye outfits, which would use fake identities, bogus firms, contacting journalists, and have it remain this sort of secret?
You know, I didn't know this was going on. I think a lot of people in the entertainment industry didn't know this was going on. I mean, everybody I talked to around Hollywood was shocked by this article, that this was the lengths to which you would go. We all knew that Harvey had very expensive lawyers. David Boies is a $1,000 an hour attorney. He had Burt Fields in Los Angeles, another $1,000 an hour attorney. These guys were very powerful, and their job was to keep Harvey out of the news in a negative context. But we had no idea that David Boies, you know, who represented Al Gore in the recount, was signing this authorization to do these kinds of things. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because David Boies is kind of a well-known super lawyer. He also argued the gay marriage case before the Supreme Court. So he's working for the New York Times, and then his law firm, hires one of these private eye outfits, which then is trying to stop the New York Times from publishing the Weinstein story. The Times fired Boies when this came out and issued this statement. Let's put it up. We consider this intolerable conduct, a grave betrayal of trust, and a breach of the basic professional standards that all lawyers are required to observe. Boies said he didn't know the details of what the private eyes were doing, but he admits to the New Yorker that he made a mistake. Now, finally, we still have Kevin Spacey, who's now been dumped from House of Cards, where he played the rogue president. More allegations against him, including one from a former Boston TV anchor, Heather Unruh, who was talking about a sexual assault, alleged sexual assault, on her 18-year-old son last year. Take a look.
To Kevin Spacey, I want to say this. Shame on you for what you did to my son.
So, Matt, when Spacey goes off to sex rehab, and he hasn't addressed any of these except for the very first actor who came out, and then he said he didn't remember, but he was sorry if it happened and he was drunk, are the media justified in assuming that he doesn't have a response, that he must be guilty?
Well, we reach out on every one of these allegation instances, and the fact that he hasn't put out a statement is somewhat telling. I mean, I think a lot of these strategies for these people have been to do one statement, and then from then on they ask that the original statement be included in the article. Harvey Weinstein did that. But, you know, this is the Kevin Spacey situation is a very serious one. This is one where there could be criminal charges against him. I know the police in a couple jurisdictions are looking into this. And there's, you know, when you don't have much to say, typically that's when you don't do a statement.
Right. That's when the publicists suddenly zip it. And it's kind of just remarkable, because a couple of weeks ago, Kevin Spacey's on top of the world. He's President Frank Underwood in the Netflix series. He's got all these projects, and now more allegations keep coming out. I keep looking at the Hollywood Reporter, and you know, half of the page is these kinds of cases. Matt Bellany, thanks very much for joining us this Sunday and getting up early for us.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Coming up, the media that pummeled Sean Spicer now slamming Sarah Huckabee Sanders, complete with some sexist insults. Dana Perino is up next. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is starting to get the Sean Spicer treatment from the press, with a twist. Some pundits are mocking her appearance as well as her performance as press secretary. Liberal New York Times columnist Frank Bruni ridiculing her enunciation while writing, "She's awful at this, but that makes her an excellent fit for an administration in which mediocrity, inadequate experience, and nepotism run rampant." And then there's SNL.
Halloween's over, but I see some of you guys are still in your journalist costumes. Some of y'all got that one, but...
Sarah, you've continually denied any connection between the Trump campaign and interference by the Russian government.
Wow. Y'all are obsessed with this. It's frickin' lame. I used to hold my breath. Now I'm letting go. I make my own choice. Bitch, I run this show.
Wow. I spoke earlier with Dana Perino, host of the new show, The Daily Briefing, co-host of The Five, and, of course, White House press secretary for George W. Bush. Dana Perino, welcome.
Thanks, Howie.
Now, White House press secretaries, as you know, are always on the front lines, but some in the press are now criticizing Sarah Huckabee Sanders, calling her a liar, even criticizing her appearance, as in that SNL clip. Does this go too far?
Well, yes, of course, I think so. You know, when I was press secretary, I don't think anybody at SNL even knew my name, and that's exactly how I liked it. But we're living in a different time, right? And everything that Sarah Huckabee Sanders says and does is scrutinized. I would like for reporters, to point out specifically where do they think she lied. I don't actually see direct accusations of that. It's more of like they just assume that she is, and I can tell you that press secretaries cannot do their job if they lie at all. It just does not happen.
Now, given the battering that Sean Spicer took, and he made some mistakes, and sometimes Sarah Sanders has to stretch a bit to defend controversial statements by White House folks, including her boss, is there any Trump press secretary who the media would find acceptable in this environment?
Oh, I don't know. I think, in a way, I had asked Sarah Huckabee Sanders a couple of weeks ago when I interviewed her, when I got a chance to fill in for Chris Wallace, if indeed the hostility was actually a little bit less than it seemed. And she said, no, the hostility was there. And I think in some ways the media believes that it goes both ways. And I think that that's partly true. We're in a very hypercharged environment. But that said, I do also hear from reporters at the White House that she does a very good job of working with them on several things that are important. For example, logistics, making sure the reporters are going to be in the right place at the right time in order to get what they need from the president to do their jobs.
Right.
That matters. And I think in some ways she has figured out a way to use a little bit of that charm and humor that you see. And I think if she dialed that up a notch, it would be useful.
Right. She's certainly not shy about criticizing the press at times. Now, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist David Horsey wrote the following, saying Sanders looks more like a chunky soccer mom who organizes snacks for the kids' games rather than the fake eyelashes and formal dresses she puts on for news briefings. Sanders seems as if she'd be more comfortable in sweats and running shoes. He apologized, and here's what he said to Megyn Kelly.
What could you have been thinking? What could you have been thinking?
I grew up in the same sexist world everybody else did, and stuff just comes out. Real men apologize. You say, okay, I did something ridiculously wrong and offensive.
Now, in that interview, Megyn also castigated him for saying in that column, referring to female journalists at Fox as blonde Barbie dolls. I knew you'd appreciate that. But how did the LA Times editors approve this column for publication?
Well, maybe they just weren't paying that much attention. And we're in this weird environment. I was raised to never say anything derogatory about people at any time. That's why, I've been uncomfortable with politics over the last couple of years. It's just not something that I think is necessary. It doesn't help anybody get anything done. It makes people feel badly about politics in Washington, D.C. It's just totally unnecessary. Shots can be taken at people for things that they've said or things that they've done or decisions that they've made. I think that any comment on physical appearance is out of bounds. And he was right to apologize, and Megyn was right to grill him.
Right. Now, when the press goes after Sarah Huckabee Sanders because she's defending comments by, let's say, the president or other White House officials that they find indefensible,